Hey everybody, welcome to Data Umbrella's webinar. My name is Reshama, and I'm going to do a brief introduction about Data Umbrella, and then we'll open up the talk to our speaker today, Nicholas. And then you can ask questions as we go along the presentation, and we will answer them when it's a good time to answer them. This is being recorded and will be placed on our YouTube. Data Umbrella is a community for underrepresented persons in data science, and we are a nonprofit organization. This is our team that makes it happen. I'm Reshama. There's Beryl from Nairobi, who will join us soon, and Christina, also in New York, and Sangam, who is out of India. We have a code of conduct, and we thank you for helping to make this a welcoming, friendly community for everyone. There's various ways to support Data Umbrella. You can follow our code of conduct, you can share our events with others, and there's ways to contribute. We have a bunch of projects on our website with video timestamps and such. Check it out. And we have a blog and events board as well, too. You can also donate to our nonprofit. We're an open collective as Data Umbrella. We have a YouTube channel with over 3,000 subscribers now, and we have all sorts of data science, Python, RStats, open source information there, so check it out. We also have playlists such as career advice, data science tech, data visualization, scikit-learn, NumPy. We encourage you to check them out. We also have a monthly newsletter. We're on dataumbrella.substack.com. We aim for the first of the month. So if you want to get some news and updates, check it out or sign up for it. This is a QR code with our most popular social media links. And I'll stop for a minute if people want to take a scan. There we go. We use BigMarker for our webinar platform, and at the very top you'll see CC for closed captioning. So if you want to have live transcripts on the bottom, you can set that setting on. We also have an online suggestion box. So if you have any ideas for future event topics, if you'd like to speak at our events, if you have any technical issues you'd like to communicate, or any other feedback, let us know. I'll share the link in the chat in a bit. Our next upcoming event is in January, and it's called What is Machine Learning Security Anyway? And it is available on Meetup to sign up now. Today's presentation is Intro to the Linux Operating System. And we have Nicholas Kyanda. Nicholas is an ICT professional with varied interests ranging from web development to copyright law to open source software. He is the publisher and editor of Intersection magazine, as well as a podcast with the same name. He has some training in basic theology from the Assemblies of God in the US. He is the founder of Hope First Enterprises. In his free time, he likes to play chess and binge watch films and TV series. He also takes a keen interest in copyright law. You can find him on LinkedIn, and you can find him on Twitter and GitHub at Hope First. And with that, I am going to hand over the microphone, the video, and the screen share to Nicholas.
Thank you very much, Reshama. Glad to be here. So my conversation today is really going to be about a basic introduction to Linux, and basically describing my journey from probably about 1998 to the present date. And in the slides, I've given you probably about maybe 12 different sections of what we're going to cover. The first part, I'll give you how I started with Linux. Then in the second part, I'll talk to you about two key characters or two key people in the ecosystem, Linus Torvalds and Richard Stallman. Then we'll talk about intellectual property, software licenses, and Creative Commons. In the next slide, we'll talk about the differences between Unix and Windows, and we'll compare them, how Linux and Windows are compared. Then we'll talk about what you can do if you install Linux. Can you install it to run on your computer on its own? Are you going to install it to run alongside other operating systems? And that's really for people who may be thinking about migrating to other operating systems, or maybe thinking about securing their information or their systems or their computers. We'll talk about virtualization or virtual versions, which is one of the ways that you can install Linux systems on your machine. We'll talk about security, what I call goodwill. We'll talk about the possibilities for mobile. We'll talk about communication communities that exist within the greater ecosystem. I'm really going to focus more on what I use in terms of Linux distributions. I usually use Ubuntu, Fedora, and openSUSE. But of course, you as users are open to decide what you want to use for your own systems. And then we'll go on to talking about how the giants, and basically Google, Microsoft, and some of the others, how they've interacted with Linux. And then we'll have a section of describing where you could go from here. And then probably a definition of terms, but what we'll do for the definition of terms, that's really going to be an area that I hope that some of you will research, because with the kind of system that you're going to be involved with, there's a psychology you have to adopt, and that's a thinking that's very much research-based. You have to have a mind that's very interested in doing research and reading and exploring and experimenting, and that will help you to learn a lot more about Linux and how to use it effectively. So my first encounter with Linux systems or computers in general was at my mom's workplace. That's the late 80s, I guess. And then, of course, also in my high school, and I remember back then, my instructor would have us work on Apple computers, and then we'd switch after about an hour to Windows. And so that gave us a rough idea what the interfaces were like. And then later on, while I worked for a small cyber cafe, I got introduced into the world of web design. Now, in terms of web design, basically, and I'll share a slide about this a little bit later, but I met a young man who was designing for a religious group. And what you'll find out in most of web design and web hosting projects is most of the servers that host these websites are actually Unix systems, and Linux is actually based on Unix. And then later on, when I spent some time in North Carolina, a friend of mine gave me a copy of Linux hardware called Linux Caldera. And so that's when I began my journey, or at least my interest in those areas, about learning more about what that kind of operating system had to offer. Later on, as I got into a little bit more about web design, learned a little bit about designing websites using Macromedia, discovered, content management systems, and these actually make your work easier when you're designing websites. And then I also found another friend who started me on the journey of learning a little bit more about how these content management systems work. And usually when you're working with content management systems, or when you're working with servers, you have to be capable, or you have to have a knowledge of, are you going to be putting your website or your servers, are they going to be based in Windows? Are they going to be based in a Linux system? Are they going to be in Mac? But mainly, you'll find out that the majority of systems that are hosting your web pages and your servers are actually Linux systems. Now, later on, the friend of mine that I told you about gave me a copy of openSUSE, and I guess he also gave me a copy of Fedora. Those are what they call, in the language of, they call them distros or distributions. And then he also taught me a little bit about what I talked about that are called content management systems. Now, when you're designing web pages, you can design your web pages using what they call what you see is what you get editors. And what those actually are, those are, it's basically like your Microsoft Word, where you get an image and you get text and you get video, and then you push a button and you say, convert into a website. Now, the content management systems are a little bit more complex because they have databases behind them. And so you get a dashboard where you add all sorts of features. You can add pages, you can add links, you can add video, you can add moving pictures. And so content management systems make things easier for you. Now, content management systems, that's where you have your Joomlas, your Blogger, you have your WordPress. Those all fall under the category of content management systems. Now, I'm telling you all of that because those function in three different environments. They're either going to function in Mac or in Windows or in Linux. In this slide, I also describe what are called, it's a stack that combines Apache, MySQL, PHP, and Perl. And those are basically languages that allow you to basically create a server on your own machine or on your own computer. And so if you're running a Linux machine, you can actually set up your own web server using tools like XAMPP. And you can run that in the Linux environment, or you can run it in the Windows environment. Later on, from my local setting in Uganda, I was also able to interact with a local Linux users group. And if possible, I suggest that you connect with your local user group, look online for that, because these users groups will help you to find communities that are also in the same environment and are working the same systems that you're working with, and you'll get support, and you'll also be able to for example, get updates for software. Back in the day, you used to have to get DVDs or CDs of software, or rather of operating systems to work with. But these days, what you do is you get them all online. But it's very useful for you in the Linux world to get in touch with a community of people that are also using the same systems, because this is where you can get your questions answered and a whole lot of more support. Now, I talked about Linux, and I talked about the three particular ones that I use, which is Fedora, openSUSE, and Ubuntu. But the really cool thing that I liked about Ubuntu is I got in touch with I think the team in Europe, and I sent them a message. I said I wanted their software, and in about 2 weeks they sent me a copy of their desktop version and their server version. But not only that, they had a very well-designed system where they had a store where you could get merchandise and all sorts of goodies from the Ubuntu network. Then I went on to experimenting. What I'm talking about here is where I would use Ubuntu on its own, or I would combine Ubuntu with Windows in what they call dual boot, or what they also call virtualization, where you run one system inside of another system. Now, of course, the challenge that some of you are going to have when you move into Linux is, where are you going to get the applications you were using in Windows? And so in my case, for some of the applications I was using, you had developers that had created a free version, for example, like for Zara, a really cool tool that I enjoy using. It's a graphic design tool. But there's also a whole list of great tools that are available to work with the Linux, within the Linux system, that are supported by some of the bigger companies that have bought into, that have decided to plug into the Linux ecosystem. These are some of the tools I use. gPorter is for podcasts. Evolution is the equivalent of Microsoft Outlook. Tomboy is a really nice tool. It works a little bit like your Wikipedia. What you do is you create little notes, and the moment you underline a word in that note, the little word that you've underlined becomes an independent page. So you end up creating little notes that are linked to each other, and that can serve you really great if you're working on a book or doing projects of that kind. Then LibreOffice is equivalent to OpenOffice. And as if I'm not wrong, it was created by Oracle. So in Windows, for example, if you're frustrated with always having to pay for your Microsoft suite of software, then you can get the equivalent, which is OpenOffice. OpenOffice is free, but of course, if you like the software, then you can make a donation and support their work. Now, Richard Stallman, let's do this. Let's take a few questions. Does anybody have a few questions for at least on our first part before we go into the second section?
No questions yet. No questions yet.
All right. So Richard Stallman is one of the key figures that I wanted to talk about, and he's responsible for what they call the free software movement. And also he's helped put together the license that is used for open source, and especially for what they call the general public license. So what he believes is he wants users to have the freedom to use, to study, to distribute, and to modify software. So Stallman pioneered the concept of what they call copyleft, which uses copyright law to preserve the rights to use, modify, distribute free software. So his license that he created, the general public license, is actually the most widely used license for free software. In 1989, he founded the League for Programming Freedom, and then he's been advocating for free software. He's also been quite an advocate against software patents, digital rights management. He refers to them as digital restrictions, and also other technical and legal terms which he believes take away users' freedoms. He is also he campaigns also strongly against non-disclosure agreements, activation keys, copy restriction, proprietary formats, and binary executables. Some of that is just especially the last part of binary executables and source code, that's pretty much the language that goes behind the software that's created, or the code that decides how your software behaves. So that image, by the way, I got it from Wikipedia, but it's licensed by Creative Commons, which is something I'm going to talk about a little bit later, as we talk about the bigger picture in terms of your use of the Linux operating system, what makes it different from Windows, and the whole movement that Richard Stallman and a few other people represent, that talks about free and open source software. Now, the other person I wanted to talk about was Linus Torvalds. He's the guy behind what they call the Linux kernel. It's just the little, the code at the heart of Linux software. So this guy, he's responsible for, Linus is responsible for the creation of the Linux kernel. He received, together with Shinya Yamanaka, a technology prize for the software he created back in 2012. He started at least working on this project, or got his first encounter in 1991, when he encountered another Swedish-speaking computer science student called Lars. Then he got familiar with the general public license after he ended up meeting Richard Stallman. And so that's how the two people are related. Now, in this third section, I wanted to talk about intellectual property, software licenses, and the Creative Commons. So my interest, or my introduction after my introduction to Linux, I did a course sponsored by Harvard Law School in conjunction with an organization in Uganda called CHARD and our local university called Makerere University. It was a course on copyright law. So every year they offer a 12-week course that you can take online. And if any of you are interested, you can reach out to me, and we're given one spot per year to recommend someone who's interested in taking the course. It's a free course, but it's very rich in terms of the content that it provides. I'll give you an overview of that content so that you can appreciate what you're going to learn during the 12 weeks. The first part of this summary of the course that I promised, they'll give you a foundation of copyright law. So they'll talk about international treaties. They'll talk about what's protected. What's important in copyright law is to understand the difference between ideas and expressions. And then they'll introduce you to the theories that talk about how different countries think about copyright law. And then they'll talk about what is covered under the section they call the subject matter of copyright. Is it music? Is it audiovisual works? Is it fiction? Is it software? So that's, of course, the part that we're interested in as people that are going to be working with Linux. Then welfare theory, authorship, joint authorship, sole ownership, works for hire. And that's important because when you create something, are you going to create it on your own? Are you creating it with somebody else? Then they talk about what they call the mechanics of copyright. where here you're talking about how long do you have rights and protections over your intellectual property. Then they have a section where they talk about your rights to reproduce and what it means to inappropriately use somebody else's content. Then they talk about the right to distribute, to perform, and to display. All of these are important. For example, if you're going to be talking about authorship, and duration and protective provisions. If in our world today we're talking about how artificial intelligence is going to be is designing or creating applications and programs, does artificial intelligence now have the rights to that information that it's created or to that software? Then how do you talk about the protections that intellectual property does artificial intelligence have the rights to that software, because artificial intelligence has created it, not human beings. And when you're dealing with human beings, when you're talking about the duration of your rights to a certain software or intellectual property, because human beings die, then the rights can be transferred to sons and daughters. But what happens when you're dealing with artificial intelligence? So there are many really interesting questions that you will learn if you take this course that will help you when you're dealing with other issues. Then there's a subject of fair use and misuse. There's a subject of there's what they call cultural theory. So there, as I said before, there are 4 theories that govern how we think about copyright. And these 4 theories are applied in different countries and in different settings. And so it will be really good for you to find out what the system looks like in your country, what your intellectual property law, how it functions, and how your system works. Do you have common law procedures? What cases have been passed and how have the judges ruled those cases if they're related to intellectual property and copyright? Then there's a section called the supplements to copyright, and then the final section of remedies and equitable relief. Now, in the section that's called fair use and misuse, there is an interesting case of a British, I suppose, either a politician or someone working in tech who resigned because he felt like information was being harvested from users and then being utilized in applications like ChatGPT. And the people that were using this information were arguing that it was being used under the fair use doctrine. But he felt that the fair use doctrine was being misused because the users who contributed the information for the artificial intelligence to mine or to utilize were not consented and were giving out the information without realizing that the information was going to be used by ChatGPT, for example. So that's an interesting application or a case about the fair use doctrine. Next, I'd suggest you do a little bit of a study about Lawrence Lessig and the Creative Commons movement. The differences between common law and civil law will also be useful, and to find out how they're practiced. And then Creative Commons licenses. Now, mainly they're not for, Creative Commons licenses are not for software, but you'll find out a lot of organizations are using them for images, for video, for contents of all sorts of types. But the Creative Commons movement is interesting because of its relationship with the free and open source movement and the copyleft movement that we talked about before. So here are the licenses. You can do, as I said, a little bit more research to find out a bit more about these licenses. Now, this next section is about the different Linux distributions. I'm not sure what some of you are using, but this is an extensive list, quite a number of license or quite a number of distributions. As I said before, I use openSUSE, I use Ubuntu, and then I also use Fedora. Currently, I'm using Fedora 34, but I also really enjoyed using openSUSE, and I really enjoyed using Ubuntu. That's the second page of your other Linux distributions. You can take your pick. Here, this section is basically a description about Microsoft and Unix and Linux. Microsoft is known for its graphical user interface. It's compatible with a range of hardware and software. Unix is used mainly for servers and other workstations and other devices. It's also used for database management, for software development, and for network applications. Linux is an open source system. It's free of cost, and it's based on Unix. Here I talk about what is virtualization. And virtualization is really what you do is you use software that simulates a hardware functionality to create a virtual system. So there are tools that can help you do that, where if you're running Windows, you get software called VMware, and then you run your Linux inside Windows. And so the software that you use, or like the application, VMware, allows you to run a full version of Linux within the Windows system. So this allows you to experiment and to play around. So here they describe the types of virtualization, or you can use the link that I've given you there to learn a little bit more. They also talk about the limitations and the advantages. I have found that using a virtual system gives me a little bit more security, but there are people who think otherwise. This is a useful description of the different companies. I found this on Quora, a site by a lady called Benish Fatima, and she talks about the different companies that are using or that are collaborating with Linux. There's Facebook, there's SUSE, there's Microsoft, there's Google, Intel, and Red Hat. And she describes that collaboration in terms of what they're doing with Linux systems. And you can find this on Quora.com. Now, the tools that you will find useful if you're going to use the dual boot option is one tool that is called Partition Master. And this is useful if you're working with older versions of Windows. What it does is it basically cuts up, or it helps you to create sections in your hard disk where you will install your Linux system. This is what your Oracle VM looks like when you install it. There's a section where it says add, and that's where you click add, and it will let you decide what are you adding. Are you adding a Windows system, or adding a Linux system onto your system as a virtual system. There are many tools, but these are some of my favorites, at least what I use in on my systems. So like I said before, this second option gives you your choice is when you go down and select Linux, or when you go down and select Windows, it will let you choose between the different versions, whether that's XP, Windows Experience, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10, Windows 11, whatever you want to try and use. And then you can run it within your current system. Now for my current setup, I found a tool called balenaEtcher, and it helps me run my Fedora 34. That's what I used to install, the Fedora 34. And I found a YouTube video that also guided me through the process. So it will be very useful as you do your research to make use of user groups, as I mentioned before, as well as Google search, which will automatically connect you to videos if you're looking for guided instructions on how to install Fedora onto your system. Now, before I talked about Partition Master, but Partition Master is a little bit more complicated because you have to split your hard disk yourself, and then it also helps you if you're working with probably Windows XP or earlier versions like Windows 7. But if you're dealing with later versions of Windows, such as Windows 10, Windows 11, then balenaEtcher is the best way to go, because there is a new system that exists within the Windows architecture that does not allow you to install dual boot systems in the ordinary way. So balenaEtcher is something that I'd recommend. Now, in this section I wanted to talk about security and goodwill. Now, the fact that you have access to Linux open source, or rather the source code of Linux, means that you can create on top of Linux, and you can see what the original developer was thinking when he was creating the software. What this means is the general feeling in the hacker community and the globe actually favors Linux as an operating system. There's a little bit of mistrust when it comes to Windows, because people don't know what's behind what's behind the source code and what it does. So the community of developers and users tends to prefer Linux systems. Now, the other strange thing is you're also more likely to find attacks against Windows operating systems than you will get against Linux operating systems, unless, of course, you're talking about information that's saved on servers and also, of course, banking systems. Now, my suggestion, if you're looking for a system that is free, that you're not going to have to pay for, that will help you, that you can develop and contribute to, that you can participate in effectively, then Linux is the way to go, which is why I currently use Linux. But as I mentioned before, I have a dual boot system, which means I work in both environments because some of my software is still in the Windows system. Now, the challenge that I've found with the virtualization is there are some critics who say that it's not the safest system, especially when you're saving your data. Although I disagree. I believe in creating complex systems that are not easy to hack, because standard systems are usually more predictable. But if you create a system within another system and you work in that system, then it's not as easy to hijack and to misuse. Here are some interesting facts about Linux. The first Linux kernel just occupied 65 KB. 2 KB is about probably 2 pages, if I stand corrected, but I think it's about two pages. Then as of 2018, there are about 20 million lines of code. All the fastest 500 supercomputers run on Linux. Linux runs everything from smartphones, servers, submarines to space rockets. Huawei, Intel, Google, Red Hat, Facebook, Canonical, and Samsung are some of the top contributors to the Linux kernel development. And then Linux is written in C language. Then they also have an interesting way of describing the code names of their releases. And then Japanese bullet trains use Linux. They also use the Linux system for train control. There's also Ubuntu phones. One of my challenges in the future is to see if I can install a Linux operating system on one of my phones. Then Linux is also used in visual effects as well as 3D animation. So as I mentioned before, Ubuntu, Fedora, and openSUSE are my favorites, but probably I tended to prefer Ubuntu just because of my interaction with the ecosystem and how quickly they responded in sending me the software that I needed, or rather the operating system that I needed. And then you will, as I mentioned before, you will do good to find a local user group in your city for collaboration and for support. Here I basically show you how the user interface looks like for openSUSE. That was the older version that I started working with in the past. It has a basic control center that lets you navigate different tools. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to look at? Are you trying to upgrade? Are you trying to look at your network? Open up your Wi-Fi, configure your Wi-Fi, all sorts of tools. Then this is a description of what openSUSE came with back in the day. There's what they call the genome and what they call the KDE. Those are two different options you have when you're installing Linux in terms of your user interface and what the look and feel of the operating system, depending on what you prefer. Then there's some terms that you'll come across when you're installing packages. So here you'll find some definitions of what those packages are, what distros are. You can look at that in your free time. Then we also try to differentiate between what these files or these systems look like in Windows and what they look like in Linux and what the equivalents are. And then here I talk about the structure of Ubuntu. As I said before, it's probably my favorite because of the reasons I mentioned before. But also they had a system that is called LTS, or long-term support, which lasts probably about 4 years, and where you get support for that Linux distribution. And then you have to upgrade it after a short while. That's what it looks like. Then I talk about my challenges with Fedora, which is what I currently run, how to install Fedora, what it looks like. And then here are some options that you have if you've been used to using Windows applications, and what you can do if you end up in a Linux environment. Then those are some useful links if you're looking for information about the collaboration between Windows and Linux, Novell and Microsoft, and some of the other companies that are working with Linux. Then these are, I wanted to kind of give you a rough idea, some of the opportunities that exist if you're going to be working with Fedora. You can do a bit of research to help you if you're looking for a career in Linux development. Are you going to be working with servers? Are you going to be working in the cloud? Where should you pay attention if you're going to take a short course so that you can develop your skills for employment in the future? The Internet of Things is still a big thing, but we've gone quiet because of machine learning and artificial intelligence. But the Internet of Things is really the desire to make sure that all sorts of devices can communicate and independently, and can be connected to possibly 5G networks. Then, of course, the cloud and virtual environments. And then another subject you might be interested in is what they call containerization. Then the next few tools or tools that are used by people who are under the Ubuntu environment, and the companies that are collaborating with Ubuntu. You've got containers that I talked about before, and the cloud, private cloud that I talked about before. Do a bit of, in your free time, it would be advisable to do a bit of a search on containers and containerization for career opportunities in those areas. Are you working in security? Are you working with workstations and in an enterprise environment? About maybe 3-4 months ago, I got a call from someone who was looking for people with Linux experience to work in banks, because, as I said before, most of these organizations work with Linux or Unix systems to manage their servers and their security systems. The cloud applications, the workstations, servers, desktops. The Internet of Things, I spoke about that before, but of course there's also a relationship between the Internet of Things and robotics. Your servers are pretty much at the heart of all data centers. Your data centers are probably running either Unix or Linux. Are you familiar with what it takes to get information in the cloud, cloud technologies, security, and all those kinds of systems? And then this is what openSUSE looks like in terms of their path for development and where they're focusing. Now, in terms of our conclusion, we've talked about the open source movement. We've talked about the difference between Linux and Windows, and how Windows does not allow you to see its source code, and how people prefer the Linux systems, especially people that are into the free and open source movement. But I suggest that you also do a bit of research in terms of privacy. What are backdoors? Backdoors are usually systems that have been designed to be accessible without the knowledge of the user. Then, of course, a little bit more about open source code philosophy and security. It will also be useful to you to do a little bit of research about surveillance law post 9/11, as well as the key revelations that emerged from the Snowden leaks, information freedom, media freedom, whistleblowing. Those are all areas that are related to the system that you're working with in terms of the open source system. Who has access to your information? Who has access to your devices? How much of a right do you have to protect your information on your devices, whether it's your phone or your computer? Does your government have access to that information, or do the telcos have access to that information? So those are all interesting ideas that you should, in my view, you should look into as you think about migrating into the Linux ecosystem, and then, of course, embracing possibly a new way of thinking. Thank you very much. I hope you found this useful.
Thanks, Nicholas. We do have a few questions. And so I will start with the first one, which is, are the features in EC2 instance same as the common Linux operating system?
EC2, I'm not familiar with EC2, but usually what happens is the different distributions of Linux, the developers of those different systems have different ideas in mind when they're developing, or when they're putting together the user interface, and the goals that they have for the design of the product are different. So usually different distributions have different goals and they have a different look and feel because they're designed by different people. The communities that are behind them are different.
Okay. The next question is, which type is much stronger or better to use? Is it Fedora, Kali, or Red Hat Linux?
Fedora, I found some challenges when I'm using Fedora because that's the system I've currently been using. Especially when I've tried to migrate from Fedora 34 to Fedora 39. Now, that may be because I'm using a dual boot system, or it may be because I have some errors in my software packages. But when you're making a selection of what to use, you have to think about the ecosystem. Does there exist a support structure that will help you when you have problems and you're trying to upgrade, or when you need support? Is there a local community that's active and vibrant that can help you if you're having problems doing basic stuff for the system? So it's really a decision you have to make. You might have to look at do a bit of research in terms of what others say about the user interface, and is it a place is it easy to navigate? Do you have all the tools that you need? Is it similar to what you've been using before? Do you have the tools that you had before if you're coming from a Windows environment? Yeah.
The next question is, kindly elaborate more on the way to go about in going with the system with the older version.
With the older version?
Right.
Okay, so the great thing about Linux is at any point in time you can install all packages of Linux on any system, and there are actually links or there are sites where you can do this directly by either downloading it onto a CD or DVD or a flash disk. And then using tools like balenaEtcher will let you install your operating system using your flash disk. If you're using your CD or DVD, then you can install directly from your disk drive. Now, in the Windows settings, I found people, for example, who swear by Windows 2000. I think there are people in Asia, in Japan, who just think it's the best thing that ever happened. So there's some people that are using older systems, because sometimes you even have software that's built for older systems and software that was not supported for newer systems, which is the case for me, for example, which I have some stuff that I use for Windows XP. I have website design tools. I have a family tree maker. I have a website support tool, but all of them run with Windows XP. So sometimes people prefer staying with the older versions, although you won't have support for those older versions. But some people prefer to use those older versions.
Great. The next question is, for someone who would like to start learning about Ubuntu, where would you suggest to go start learning? Are there any courses that you would recommend?
The best thing I would do is go onto the Ubuntu website. You can actually get a lot of information from Wikipedia, but I think I've also provided a link to the Ubuntu website, and then join the Ubuntu community. Then when you join the Ubuntu community, you will find resources, you will find access to literature that can guide you if you're looking to get into the use of the Ubuntu system. As I said before, I have this was given to me back in 2011. I still have the desktop version and the server version, but I've never used the server version because it runs on a different type of hardware. But most of my learning has come from experimentation. Install it on your machine, get a machine you don't usually use, go to YouTube, find out how to install the Ubuntu onto your machine, and then play around with it. There's very little that you can do to ruin your system. It's very easy to use, and then, as I said, there's lots of support if you're looking for a community to help you do things. You have to, if you join a community, then you ask questions, and people have been answering questions for a long time. So the questions you're asking will probably not be new, and so you will get support if you use that method.
Thanks, Nicholas. And there's one more question, which is, hi, thanks for your presentation. A while back, there was a hack with balenaEtcher. What are the alternatives, if any, to this tool? For example, other openly available imaging / flashing.
For Windows 10, I'm afraid I have no other tools that I know of that can help you with this. But of course, if you go to if you do a search on how to install Linux using a flash disk or how to install Linux in general, you'll get different tools that are available. I just happened to land on balenaEtcher. Especially because, as I mentioned before I was working with Windows XP and Windows 7 and Windows 8. And the way those systems are structured, you're allowed to reconfigure or resize your partition, your hard disk, so that you can install automatically, or at least in an easier manner. Because when you put in your installation disk, it will guide you through the process. So it will tell you where do you want to install this software or this operating system. So if you've split up your hard disk in the right manner, then you can say, okay, I want it installed in the certain section or hard disk named F, which you already given space. So they'll recommend how much space you need for that installation. And then when you put the CD in or the DVD in, it will give you the option of installing it on that particular partition, and it will do the rest for you. At least that's how it was with version 10 or version 11 that I used before. I'm not too familiar with the current Ubuntu system that exists right now. But that was independent of these particular tools that help you do this in a simpler way. If you want to go the hard way without these tools, then you get your partition manager, you partition your hard disk drive, especially for earlier versions of Windows, and then you just put in your CD, DVD, and you're good to go.
Nicholas, thank you so much for presenting to Data Umbrella. We had a lot of questions, a lot of people interested in Linux. We'll be in touch with the recording. The recording should be up within 24 hours. Okay. And thank you to everybody for joining as well. Thanks so much for taking the time to attend.
Okay, thank you.